Our next speaker will be Sherman from the Department of Psychology, and her talk is entitled Social Media and the Teen Brain.
What is it that makes a teenager a teenager? Depending on your age, you may have very different answers. But in reality, throughout the world, the teenage years are defined by social discovery, defining yourself in relation to others, fitting in with peers, and of course, romantic relationships. Looking back, do you remember how intense everything felt? My goal as a developmental psychologist is to better understand what makes the teenage years feel so intense. And many researchers believe that part of the reason for this intensity is that there's something special about the adolescent brain. In particular, that it's tuned in to social interaction at this age, perhaps more than any other. Now, when I was a teen in the early 2000s, I experienced a lot of this intensity, not only in face-to-face social settings, but also online. And the internet for today's teens is even more pervasive because it's in their phones. It's with them wherever they go. And this can be a frightening concept for many adults for a couple of reasons. First off, many worry that these types of interactions are somehow more distant or less intuitive than human interaction. And additionally, these types of interactions have become an essential part of adolescents' lives just when scientists tell us that their brains are uniquely vulnerable. So I'm not surprised when I hear people ask, what is the effect of social media on the teen brain? It's a question that I've long been curious about myself. But when I began to look to see how psychology and neuroscience answered this question, I was surprised to find that actually very little research had been done. And perhaps that's because it's a very large and very general question. So as a researcher trying to design a feasible study, I had to begin by asking smaller questions. So I considered, what is it about social media that is unique? What makes it different from face-to-face interaction? And one answer stood out to me. So if I tell a joke here in this room, I can gauge its success by those of you who are smiling or laughing or maybe shifting uncomfortably in your seat. But if I tell the same joke on Twitter, I gauge my response by the number of favorites and retweets. So in other words, what was previously a purely qualitative judgment is now quantitative. And this is true not only of Twitter, but of Facebook and Tumblr and Pinterest. Sometimes it's called a like, sometimes it's called a favorite, but it's ubiquitous. And as I thought more and more about these likes, I began to wonder if they actually affected the way that teens perceive information online. Do their brains actually track differences in popularity? Well, to begin to test this question, I had to figure out how to get social media inside the MRI scanner here at the UCLA Brain Mapping Center. And at first, I actually thought this would be easy, but it turns out that tools like Facebook and Twitter are actually really complex. Lots of conversations and ideas all flowing at once. It's not really ideal for an experiment. But then, about 2 years ago, another tool began to rise in popularity among teens, the photo sharing app Instagram. And for me, this was a game changer because Instagram was much simpler, which meant we could replicate it in the MRI scanner. So it allowed us to ask this question. Say I'm a teen looking at my friend's photo on Instagram. Is my experience of this photo, my perception of the photo, in any way affected by the fact that it has 3 likes? What if instead of 3 likes, it had 50 likes? Does my brain actually track this difference? And how might my perception change if instead of looking at my friend's Instagram photo, I'm looking at my own? So to answer this question, we recruited 13 to 18-year-old adolescent Instagram users. We invited them into the lab, and beforehand, we asked them to submit 40 of their own Instagram photos, which we then combined into a single feed that we showed them through a pair of special goggles in the MRI scanner. We told them that during the scan they could like the photos the same way they do on Instagram, and they would also be able to see how many likes each of the photos had previously received from the other participants. Well, that's the story we told them anyway. In reality, we manipulated the number of likes so that half of the photos appeared with a lot of likes, and the other half appeared with just a few. And this allowed us to directly compare the popular and unpopular photos. So what did we find? Did participants' brains actually track the difference in popularity? Well, in order to answer that question, we examined which areas of the brain showed greater activation when participants viewed other people's photos with many likes compared to just a few. And we saw this greater activation in a few areas. One of these areas, shown here in gold, is called the temporoparietal junction, and it's involved in processing socially meaningful cues from the environment. We also saw greater activity in the visual cortex, shown here in red, which suggests that potentially participants are paying closer attention to these popular photos. So in other words, we discovered that teens process information online differently when they know that information is popular. So what happened when teens saw their own pictures with many likes versus a few? Well, here we saw greater activation in an area called the nucleus accumbens, or the reward center, shown here in green. And the reward center is activated when you win money or when you see a picture of someone that you love, but it's not simply an indicator of good feelings. In fact, it's part of the neural circuitry that's involved in learning and motivation, which suggests that getting likes doesn't just feel good in the moment, but rather it may actually be changing or shaping the way that teens respond in the future. So consider this selfie. Say a teen takes a selfie and it gets a lot of likes. She's inclined to take more selfies in the future. Now, it's easy to fall into the trap as adults of seeing these behaviors as narcissistic. But in fact, another recent study found that on the whole, Instagram photos containing people get significantly more likes than Instagram photos containing only objects. So perhaps what we're actually seeing here is an example of adolescents effectively learning from their audience. So we discovered that the popularity of a photo has a significant effect on the way that photo is perceived. Likes are rewarding. They activate the same neural circuitry that motivates us to engage in all sorts of incentive-focused behaviors. But that's not the whole story. Areas of the brain involved in social processing are also coming online. Teens are paying more attention to these popular photos. Something as simple as a little number, provided in this case by complete strangers, triggers a variety of neural processes. Just like in school hallways or at the mall, social media has become an environment in which teens have learned to be attuned to the subtleties of peer opinion. Now, these findings are just the first step in beginning to define the role of the internet in adolescents' lives and their brains. And now that we know how these likes are represented in the brain, we can begin to examine how they relate to behavior, both online and off. So for example, can these neural regions indicate which teens are more likely to give in to peer pressure? Can we predict which ideas will spread on social media? And as we begin to answer these questions, I think it's important that we don't simply think about the internet as the source for good or evil, but rather that we try to understand how it works and what makes it motivating. We have to keep in mind that it's a moving target. The internet is a constantly growing, constantly changing tool, and our brains have the power to change with it.